Hello, macroeconomic students. Okay, so this is video two going over the chapter three supply and demand intro chapter, right? We need the tool of supply and demand. And then the video one, the first part, we talked about demand and what that represents, mostly from a microeconomic standpoint, individual markets, but also trying to hint at how that might also be looked at in an aggregate for the economy as a whole standpoint, which we will obviously do in this course. Then supply, producers producing stuff, right? And basically now the only way we make a market is we bring producers and sellers together and try to figure out, well, how do we use that demand thing, the construct we just defined, and the supply thing that we just defined in part one to predict what might happen to prices when things change. Well, first of all, how we might determine what prices will be, and then how, even more so, how it might change when the market changes, either the demand changes or the supply changes. So here's a really simple market, right? Definitely a very basic microeconomic example where we have demand represented by a schedule, which actually after this slide, I don't think you'll see anything quite like that again in this course. But here is demand, right? So prices and the quantity of ice cream that people want to buy in this little market, consider it a town or something on any given day. Um, Supply at each price for ice cream cones, how many people the producers want to sell, and maybe this is a whole state or something. These are millions, right? The bottom line is the poll asks what price, given this is demand currently, and given that this is representation of supply currently, what price is the price that's most likely to exist? And likely ask a poll for this and look at it and think about it. And hopefully you come to the logical conclusion that given this demand and this supply, the price that will likely exist is $2. Because that is the price at which the amount of ice cream cones that people want to buy is the same as the amount of ice cream cones that companies, producers, sellers want to sell. And that is basically equilibrium. When the amount that people want to buy and companies want to sell, I'm sorry, my wife just contacted me. Okay. Yeah, let me just reply here. Okay. Is the same. Sorry about that. So that would equilibrium. So equilibrium is defined by two things. An equilibrium price, the price at which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Right? And that's basically how this basic model of supply and demand works. So if we take the representation of this demand and the supply instead of as a schedule as demand curve, supply curves by plotting this price quantity combinations on the demand side and on the seller side, we can create something that looks like this. And hopefully, not surprisingly, the equilibrium is where those two curves, the supply and demand, cross. Right? The equilibrium is the intersection, and it's always every equilibrium in the supply and demand analysis is composed of the equilibrium price, the price at which the quantity demanded, equilibrium quantity is the same. So this is, and most of the time when we use this, we're going to focus almost exclusively on this intersection and how that intersection is expected to change, especially how it's expected to change prices when either demand changes, i.e. shifts, or supply changes, i.e. shifts. And we'll talk about that here in a second. And then equilibrium. So we've already talked about the law of demand in the first part, the first video, where as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. Right? Law of supply, producers more willing to produce a product, so as price goes up, the quantity supplied increases, so that's why we have an upward sloping supply curve. The law of demand is why we have a downward sloping demand curve. Oh, shit. What the hell just happened? I'm gonna try to keep going here. The video's going. All right. Why we have it up? I'm having all kinds of problems. Maybe I'm supposed to stop it now. I'm gonna keep going. All right. Law of supply and demand is the new thing. Is basically what I just described. Is the price is going to try to adjust to balance, right? To clear the markets, where the quantity the companies are wanting and able to sell is the same as the quantity the company that people are wanting and able to buy. So if we're not at that equilibrium price is going to try to adjust to that equilibrium. So here is back to the market for Uber rides that we were talking about in part one, right, the earlier slides. Well, if the equilibrium in some market for Uber rides is this $13.25, but we find that currently the price is higher than that, we're going to have a bunch of Uber riders driving around that don't have any customers because there aren't enough customers willing to pay or able and willing to pay $13.75. So the existing drivers are likely to start lowering their prices, and as they lower their prices, then it'll attract some more people, and we'll keep moving until we kind of move towards that equilibrium. So prices try to adjust to get to equilibrium. Alternatively, if the price is too low, by the way, price too high, surplus, i.e. excess quantity supplied at the existing price. Whereas if the price is too low, there's a shortage because people can afford to buy more than companies are willing, able to produce. So it's going to basically cause drivers to be really busy at 12.75. It's like, hey, I bet I could raise my price to $13 and still sell, fill up my day. And then that'll make a few less people want Uber rides, and price tries to go up to get rid of the shortage until we get to equilibrium. So price tries to adjust to equilibrium. In some markets, that happens really quickly, like, um, well, market that we don't analyze so much, but the stock market, it happens incredibly quickly. Commodity markets, where oil, for example, is traded on a commodity exchange, kind of like a stock market, happens very quickly. So like wholesale oil prices, wholesale commodity prices. Some markets, this doesn't happen quickly at all, like labor markets, which we'll analyze a bunch, right? During COVID, there was both an increase in demand and a decrease in supply of nurses, for example, which caused this scenario at the existing wage rate shortages. So since COVID, this has been adjusting to where the wages are going up and then starting to move. But that process happens much more slowly. But bottom line is the law of supply and demand is still at play. Just some markets it happens really easily and efficiently. Some takes a long time. Okay, so now that is talking about a kind of a static analysis, right? If we're not at the equilibrium in the current situation, the current supply, the current demand, if where price is too high, surplus, price is going to go down to get the equilibrium. Price is too low, going to go move up. If, however, something changes in the market, so let's assume we are at equilibrium, and that's where we're going to assume most of the time. Most of the time, we're going to assume that markets are at equilibrium and when we are doing our analysis, as opposed to this scenario. So, if markets were at equilibrium, but something happens, like we talked about, to change demand. So, for example, if something happens to increase demand, so let's talk about an economy as a whole example. So if consumer confidence increases and aggregate demand, so the demand for everything in total increases, demand shifts to the right, what we really need to be able to do with this analysis of supply and demand is kind of say, well, in what direction will prices and the size of the market. So equilibrium quantity, the size of the market, equilibrium price, the price level, in what direction will it likely move? And anytime there's a change in demand or a change in supply for that matter, some combination of these things is going to happen. So which combination would an increase in demand result in? And it's only going to be one of these. Okay. And it is going to be A. So how do we see that it is A? So here is, let's imagine that this is the market before consumer confidence increased. And actually, if this was chapter 12, we would label this demand as aggregate demand and the supply as aggregate supply. But we don't have to go there right now. So something happens to increase demand. Well, remember, an increase in demand is a shift to the right at any given price level. People can afford to buy more. So that old equilibrium was happening here at this price or price level P1, quantity 1. Excuse me, increase in demand. A combination of two things has to happen. So it has a combination to get to from this old to this new equilibrium. Well, you can just look at it on the graph, but hopefully your logic in thinking through it will match what's on the graph. But some combination of prices going up. So equilibrium, excuse me, take a sip of water here. I'm making too many videos already. Excuse me. Equilibrium price increasing. And even though prices are going to be going up to help rebalance, right, get back to the new equilibrium with this new increase in demand, well, since prices are going up because people can afford to buy more, part of that rebalancing is going to also happen from an increase in equilibrium quantity, increase in the size of the market for whatever we're talking about. Now, whether it's a little bit of an increase in price and a lot of increase in quantity or vice versa, well, that's beyond the scope of what we need for this macro class. Well, I guess I will talk about it a little bit actually. But the bottom line is a little bit of both is happening. So anytime demand is increasing, go back to our multiple choice question here, it's going to be some combination of increasing price and increasing quantity going to happen. And if the question had been if demand decreases for some reason, so people become more pessimistic about the economy, well, then it's going to be B, right? Anytime there's a change in demand, the only possible answers are A or B, right? Either we're shifting from D1, increasing demand, to D2, so price and quantity are both going up, or if the original was D2 and demand decreased, so these arrows are going the opposite direction to D1, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity would decrease. And by the way, this is the most important thing to retain or understand leaving this chapter 3 for our course, is being able to analyze what happens in markets or what's the expectation when demand either increases or decreases, or as we're about to look at, whether supply increases or decreases. How does that impact the market? So for demand, increase in demand, both price and quantity increase, decrease in demand, both price and quantity decrease. Now, looking at supply. Let's assume for a moment supply decreases. So, um, so for example, it gets more expensive to produce products because labor um, wages go up. So companies have to produce more. So at any given selling price, um, for the profit level incentive is decreased because it costs more to produce the product. So which of these would result from a decrease in supply? Hopefully, you can intuitively say, since A and B were the changes in demand answers, the only answers that are possible for a change in supply are C and D. So let's see which one it is by doing the same thing we just did with the increase in demand example. So supply has decreased. How do we show a decrease in supply? Well, at any given selling price, companies are willing, able to produce less. Supply shifts to the left. So then we just follow the bouncing, the equilibrium, i.e., where is this old equilibrium, this where they cross, compared to the new on both the vertical price axis and the horizontal demand axis? Well, as we can see, just like with the increase in demand, right, the price is going to be predicted to go up because companies are producing less. So the price, it's going to put upward pressure on prices. But unlike the increase in demand, where even though prices were going up, that was happening because people wanted to buy more. In this case, prices going up because companies are willing, able to produce less. So the rebalancing is going to be partially from an increase in prices. And when that happens, some people who wanted it on the demand, so you know, if we're talking about Uber rides, if the price was $13 at P1 and now it's $14 at P2, some people did wanted it at at 13, but now they don't want it at 14, so the equilibrium quantity is going to decrease because of that. Not because demand has changed, because remember, demand only changes when something other than the price that consumers care about changes. This is a change in supply. So whenever supply decreases, the new equilibrium happens from some combination of equilibrium price increasing and equilibrium quantity decreasing. Now, I forgot that I was going to talk about this in these slides. So in the real world, right? So we kind of need to be able to dissect these events one by one. But in the real world, there's almost never just one thing happening at a time, right? We might have a scenario where um, both demand is increasing for one reason and supply is decreasing for another reason, and then we need to try to predict, well, what's going to happen in the market. So let's put two events together. So let's say we have an increase in demand, which we've already defined as, hey, that's going to put upward pressure on prices. And also simultaneously something happens to decrease supply, and that also puts upward pressure on prices. And since each event independently put upward pressure on prices, we know that an increase in demand combined with a decrease in supply is going to make prices go up. And the example that I go over in the microeconomics class demonstrates that specifically, right? Which I've decided not to get into the details of here, just keep it a little more amorphous. However, as far as the size of the market, it's a little more ambiguous what's going to happen unless you know which of these two events is more significantly impacting the market. Is there going to be a big increase in demand and only a little bit of a decrease in supply, or vice versa? Or, like I've drawn it in this case, the increase in demand is proportional, looks like approximately, to the decrease in supply, where the new equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity was going to stay about the same. However, that's only true if this is drawn to scale if you know the relative size of the shifts. I'm actually going to get out of presentation mode here for a second. What if instead we have a really big increase in demand, but a really small decrease in supply? Our equilibrium is now here, and our equilibrium quantity would have increased because the demand increase was very profound, but the supply decrease was very small, so the demand dominated. And since the demand impact on quantity is to increase it, that's what would happen. Or if it was the other way around, the opposite would happen. So you need to know the relative size of the shifts. I don't think I've changed anything that I care about. Okay, sorry. So here's that example or similar example in a textbook. right? Unless you know the relative size of the shifts, if both things are shifting, um, hard to know what's going to happen. So this is the Uber rides. So when COVID hit, there was both a decrease in demand because people worried about the riders, the consumers worried about getting COVID, and also a decrease in supply. The drivers worried about getting COVID. Now, whether that's going to result in prices going up for Uber rides or down for Uber rides depends on which is more significant, right? Is are the drivers going to want to drive? Are they going to decrease their willingness to provide rides more than the decrease in demand from consumers? If that's the case, then the price of Uber rides is going to go up. However, if the consumer is the one that goes away more, right, they're more scared than the drivers go away, well, that's going to cause the price of Uber rides to go down. So my question at the bottom here is what happened for economy as a whole during COVID? Um, well, we had deflation. So imagine instead of this being Uber rides, which I just described what would happen in each case, um, imagine I tell you that this is the economy as a whole instead of Uber rides, these two possible examples. Which one demonstrates? So in April and May of 2020, so the beginning of COVID and the lockdown, prices did go down, right? So price level, we had deflation. There was a few months where prices actually went down, which doesn't happen that often. Um, so that means that the demand for everything on aggregate demand decreased by more in those few months than the willingness availability of products decreased. So that caused prices to go down. If the availability of products decreased by more, so a bigger shift in supply than there was a decrease in demand, we would have had price level go up. And that's how you kind of have to analyze these things when you bring the two things together. Okay. So this is just an intro, right? So you need to understand these shifts and be able to answer questions for this chapter. And then the important thing is to be able to utilize this basic model in the ways that we're going to use it in this course, which we'll get to in future chapters.